Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well wherever you are in the world. I'm Guy Platten, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this latest edition of the ICIS Leadership Insights Live series, where we aim to spark different conversations by bringing together leaders from inside and outside of the shipping sector to look at the key strategic global issues that impact our industry. Our discussion today will take a snapshot of the status of global trade, which, according to the World Trade Organization's latest Outlook update, is growing at a slower pace than was previously forecast, with current predictions showing growth of just 0.8% in 2023, down from a 1.7% forecast earlier in the year. We also know from our own day-to-day operations and from UNCTAD's review of maritime transport, published actually in September, that 2023 continues to be a year of turmoil in international maritime supply chains. The roots of this lie in the after effects still of COVID congestion, which are still having an impact and are compounded, of course, by the geopolitical tensions, regional conflict, tighter monetary policies, particularly across the United States and Europe, and the subsequent changing trade dynamics across all maritime sectors. Amongst this uncertainty, the industry needs to find a way, not just to decarbonise, but also to do in an economically efficient manner to ensure global food and energy security. There are many questions to answer about the best way to achieve this goal, and we are fortunate to have three expert speakers on hand today whose insight will help us navigate these shifting trading patterns. Just to let you know, the discussion will be recorded and will be made available to attendees after the meeting. And we please do encourage you to participate by asking questions using the question function on the control panel. And I will endeavour to go through as many of those questions as we can before we end the hour. But first, let me introduce today's expert panel. Firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Shamika Sirimane, Director, Division of Technology and Logistics, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, whose group are responsible for compiling the review of maritime transport. Welcome, Shamika.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Alan Beecham, Group Managing Director and Logistics and Supply Chain Specialist, Toll Group. Welcome, Alan, and thank you very much for joining us during your evening. We're delighted you could join us.
Thanks, Guy. Good to be here.
And completing our panel today is Turlock Mooney, Director, S&P Global Marketing Intelligence. Welcome, Turlock.
Thanks, Guy. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And Shamika, perhaps if we could start with you. The UNCTAD review of maritime transport provides us all with a detailed analysis of the trends in seaboard trade. And at ICS, we are, of course, delighted to have been part of the peer review team for elements of the latest report. Perhaps you could start by setting the scene for us about the key trends that the RMT identifies when it comes to maritime trade dynamics in 2023. Thank you, Shamika.
Thank you so much, Guy. And can I also thank you for being an amazing peer reviewer for the review of maritime transport report, because we really benefit from the insights from the industry. So I think the context is the weakening of the global economy, and then we also see the geopolitical risks surrounding us all. So based on the sector's resilience in navigating the last 3 years of disruption, we forecast the moderate growth of global seaborne trade, which is, we say it will expand by 2.4% in 2023 and by around 2% as we go into the medium term. Now, when it comes to the containerized trade, we expect the sector to grow by 1.2% in 2023 and 3% between 2024 and 2028. But as you can see, these are all well below the long-term trend growth. So that's one thing. The second we also note is there's a shifting trade patterns driven by geoeconomics fragmentation concerns. Our data is starting to show signs of shifting trade patterns, and our report has underscored that grain and oil shipments traveled on average the longest distances on record last year, and as countries have been forced to seek alternative markets and providers in this context of disruption. The third, I'm sure many of you will start talking, I will just identify one small part of it, It's the whole idea of the de-risking supply chains is in the forefront and in every conversation. This is about making the supply chains more flexible and responsive to cope with uncertainty and volatility. We understand that this is all very good, but we at UNCTAD, we think diversifying new suppliers and markets is the way to go. And we do not see friendshoring, nearshoring is an economic solution. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Shamika. That's very interesting about the nearshoring and friendshoring, actually, which is very timely. So I can turn to you now, perhaps, Alan. We've actually heard the changes in supply chain management, specifically about trends like Shamika's just talked about, are a part of the shifting trade dynamics that are likely to characterize the next few years of maritime transport trade. Is that analysis consistent with your group's experience of the changing scenarios and shifting patterns of seaborne trade? And what is Toll Group doing to actually adapt to these shifts and to ensure that the supply chain resilience is available at this uncertain time? So thank you, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Shamika. I'm extremely encouraged by some of the things that you say there, because and I wouldn't dare doubt the quality or the depth of your research, and therefore take it as kind of a true point of view. But from what is a felt experience, we would say that we've seen a significant slowing of containerized freight movement on certain lanes over the course of last year, and to some extent a contraction in certain product and types of goods as the economies have slowed down in the US in particular, and the economies have slowed down in Europe, and then also latterly in Oceania, or Australia and New Zealand. And we saw that flow. US went first, then to Europe as the Ukraine war hit, and then into Australia. Through the middle of this year, we saw those reductions. As we look at our outlook into next year, we probably also don't see many stimuluses for growth, and so that's consistent with the figures that you put there in terms of a pretty flat position of trade. But what we are seeing is more capacity coming into the market. We are seeing more ships arriving. All those ships were ordered during the COVID times. Very consistent with shipping behavior is order in the good times and receive them in the down times, and that trend is without a doubt continuing. What's perhaps amplified it is obviously though the change in legislation and the forecast of change in legislation as it comes to emissions and other features. But why don't I more specifically answer the question around, and I think your really interesting comment at the end there about friendshoring or nearshoring as sort of being a myth, or not really being a feature or a factor and being uneconomic. I think it's quite possible that your comments of being uneconomic, I would agree with. I absolutely understand the point of that. But I am seeing change and shifts in the supply chain. There's been a significant inflow of production into Vietnam. If you look for either production facility, land, or warehousing space in Vietnam, it's extremely difficult to come by. If you look to India, India is extremely proactive in trying to promote manufacturing within India and trying to attract foreign direct investment and to set up. And you would go for no mobile phones being produced in India perhaps 5 or 10 years ago to now, with Foxconn movement and so on, a significant volume of mobile phones being produced and an active development. Now, India is not necessarily friendshoring and nearshoring, but more an economy really establishing itself and moving up. So in of itself, you can't say, well, that's friendshoring or nearshoring. It's really the rise of India as a country and economy in a global area. But the changes into Vietnam, the changes into Malaysia, with the medtech industry moving into Malaysia, in addition to the already well-established technology sector, is a shift in what had been a traditional environment where a lot of those goods were manufactured in China. And I think that's building in resiliency. It isn't that they're leaving China, it's that they're adding extra capacity to try and build some resilience into the supply chain. If you take, Lego, and Lego's now looking at its production on a global basis into at least 3 zones, being, it's China production, now Vietnam production, but also, US and European production. It's also looking at it from a transport point of view, carbon and connectivity, which is ultimately the true lean test that all of the automotive factories set up earlier, which is to try and establish the place of manufacturing as close to the market as possible, which means you can shorten the lead time from order to cash. So I personally think you will see experimentation in some of these areas from companies over the coming decade. I do think there are inflationary effects if you move into the wrong location too quickly without an established supply chain and without clarifying how you will get your tier 2 and your tier 3 manufacturing undertaken. But it doesn't stop people deciding that they will take a more expensive supply chain for a more resilient supply chain. And I think it is that notion of resiliency that is really driving the change in behavior. I talk to customers about the 3 R's of supply chain as being the evolution of what was just in time, that went through COVID to just in case, that now needs to become, in my view, a focus on the 3 R's, which is a resilient supply chain, a responsive supply chain, and a responsible supply chain. And within that, you still need the aspects of just in time, but you need more than that, and you can't rely on that kind of very fragile, singular, optimized pathway to market. So we, in Toll have been trying to invest in capabilities in different parts of the world to try and build up that, balance of service and supply to our customers to allow them to actually have more resilient and responsive supply chains, being able to change mode easily from ocean to air in our sea air product, or from truck to rail in terms of carbon, if that's a driver. So I think there are shifts happening in the supply chain. If I look outward, what I will leave you with is I think the next 10 years will be the most disruptive and exciting elements of our supply chain, as change in legislation for carbon drives change, as change in geopolitical risk drives change, and as technology drives change in of itself.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating, Alan, as well. We've already got some questions coming in for you, actually.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
Okay, Alan, can I say, I think I agree with everything you said. And I think your example of Malaysia, Vietnam, this is an example of diversification of supply chains. That's what we call in UNCTAD. And I think diversification is good, because diversification is going towards the low cost and a high efficiency sources. So we believe that's how we can de-risk the supply chains, by diversification. Sorry, Guy, I had to jump in.
Thanks, Shamika. Now we've got lots and lots of questions coming in, so I'll leave them to the end, but we're certainly stimulating debate here amongst our audience, so really appreciate that. But I don't want to leave Turlock out of it now, so to get in there to really think it. So coming to you now to pick up on the point about efficient supply chain management. From the perspective of port operations, the review concludes that investing in digitalization and technology can create efficiencies and reduce delays. When it comes to efficient ports, smooth sailing also depends on well-oiled regulatory processes, and trade facilitation measures are an important part of this. Could you take us through some of the key regulatory changes, particularly with regard to digitization of processes, which will help maritime transport trade maintain supply chain resilience in the face of ongoing uncertainty? So over to you, Philip.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. And yeah, some very interesting points there from the first 2 speakers, indeed. Yeah, first of all, I mean, the conclusion of the RMT that investing in digitization and technology is critical to, create efficiencies and reduce delays in the ports is, of course, absolutely correct. We often get asked about deficiencies in physical infrastructure at ports. Alan mentioned some of the lack of available infrastructure further up the supply chain in places like Vietnam. You certainly have ports too with deficiencies in physical infrastructure, particularly of course in developing countries, and some of those ports would serve hinterlands with a substantial potential for sourcing goods and components, and frequent delays or chronic congestion would be undermining that potential to a greater or lesser extent. In some cases, you could say completely nullifying advantages they may have in terms of things like lower labor costs and so on and so forth. But on a global level, the bigger efficiency opportunity is really around digitization. When it comes to ports, it has the potential to get so much more out of the system and the assets that are already in place. If we think about port call processes and the complexity of port operations in general, the large number of stakeholders involved, large quantities of data produced, what's really required are these digital ecosystems that support management and exchange of good quality data at the right time between the different stakeholders, shipping lines, terminal operators, shippers, port services, clearance agencies, etc. And to your direct question, from a regulatory perspective, the key instrument would probably be the IMO's FAL Convention, originally adopted in the mid-1960s, of course, and contains standards and recommended practices and rules for simplifying requirements and procedures around vessel calls. It has been continuously updated with a primary focus on digitization and automation of processes to try to minimize inefficiencies from things like sharing compliance documentation around port entries through EDI communication, etc. So under the convention, it's actually been mandatory for ships and ports to exchange data electronically since 2019. And it was amended again in the aftermath of the pandemic to oblige public authorities from January of next year to develop maritime single windows to exchange information. Compliance, unfortunately, has been fairly slow. The technology is there, but the challenge has been getting the many private and public stakeholders on board to actually start collaborating and sharing data. Also resource issues, of course, for many port authorities. You obviously need people, you need funding. Also some inconsistencies with national legal frameworks can be an issue. But it certainly makes 2024 an important milestone to accelerate digitization in maritime trade. Let's not forget also important work by organizations like the DCSA, which is developing standards for many of these processes, and not just standards, but also working on trying to get the industry moving on key initiatives like port call optimization, just-in-time vessel arrivals, and so on. Beyond, say, the FAL Convention, other regulations influencing the pace of digitization in perhaps a more indirect way would include, for instance, regulation related to industry decarbonization. The targets for reduction in carbon intensity in shipping and emissions in general are, of course, very ambitious, and they're to come from a mix of design, operational, and economic solutions. Optimizing vessel speeds is one very important lever the industry has to tackle emissions, and that depends heavily on better network and port call efficiency. Reducing negative environmental impact from shipping and port operations is, of course, one of the biggest drivers of programs like port call optimization and just in time. There are many other benefits too, but emissions reduction would be a very big one. You want to identify and reduce waste in port call processes, so vessels need to spend less time in port and to make port calls more predictable in general, and that provides the opportunities to do things like control speeds to reduce fuel burn and emissions. And successful delivery of these kind of programs is highly dependent on digitization to ensure data is recorded, shared at the right time with the right stakeholders, which improves access to critical information, which leads to better and more synchronized decision making, and ultimately more efficient port operations. So regulation around emissions reduction will increasingly also be one of the big drivers of progress in digitization for the industry as well. And I'll pause there and hand back to you, Guy.
Yeah, thank you. Before I move on to the next section a little bit, and actually you're a good segue into the environmental issues, but a question's come in for you, which is you talked about digitizing port processes, but we've just seen huge disruption when the systems of DP World Australia were hacked this week. How are ports protecting those digital solutions to make sure that incidents like that don't disrupt trade? And that must be a real risk.
Absolutely correct. It's a real risk. We've seen cyber security and incidents that have disrupted port operations. There are several a year now, in fact, not just more advanced systems of sharing information, but even very standard terminal operating systems, etc. This has been a threat for some time. This is the downside to digitization, and it's something that needs to go hand in hand with it to ensure that the data and the systems are protected. Typically when ports are investing in systems, especially big players like DP World, there's a very extensive security operation as well, and looking into the cybersecurity risks, etc. But these things aren't foolproof, and we see that all the time. So no question, there is a downside to digitization in terms of risks from cybersecurity risks to disruption of operations, and it is something that needs to be heavily invested in alongside the digitization initiatives themselves.
Thank you very much. Before turning back to Shamik on some of the environmental issues, just a question for you, Alan, as well, which is coming, and I don't want to lose it from your excellent opening remarks. You mentioned the issue of more ships being built at a time of slow economic growth. What impact will that overcapacity have on the market, do you believe, going into 2024?
I think the simple answer would be that rates will continue to fall, and there will be significant rate instability through next year. What that really means, though, is what then happens. What is the response of the shipping lines, and how does that play out? If you look at reliability, pre-pandemic reliability was easily running above 80% of shipping operators, and quite regularly, running in the 90s, and obviously everybody was wanting it to be, in the high 90s from a reliability. During the pandemic, we got down as low as in the 30s, and obviously for obvious reasons around bottlenecks and the whole system sort of clogging. Now we're back and running somewhere between 60 and 80% reliability. And I think this is a hypothesis that's being run by the shipping lines of kind of what is acceptable relative to blanking, and the disruptions that come, or the impact on reliability that blanking drives. And so, as I look to next year, I think when that capacity comes in and continues to come in, you'll see rates fall. then you'll see GRIs, general rate increases being forced through. You'll then see blanking being forced through, and you'll see this bounce around between 60 and 80% sort of reliability, which make it highly difficult to run a tight and predictable supply chain, which is why I say, that real need is to have a responsive supply chain and to be able to, for those that need it, deal with that and work out, well, how do I make sure I get on the right ship that comes into the port at the right time? So I would forecast a turbulent year.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Thank you. Perhaps, Shamika, turning to you now and to broaden discussion a little bit more on the environmental efficiencies as well as the economic issues. We've also had a question come in for you, which actually dovetails into this nicely, which is in the 2023 RMT, it includes that swift intervention at the policy and regulatory level is needed to stimulate demand for alternative fuels, green technologies and fleets, to encourage industry to invest. And what role is UNCTAD playing in influencing policy and regulation to support the shipping industry in this objective? So just over to you, really. I'd like to get your insights into this particular area.
Thank you, Guy. I think, this is just $1 million question or the $1 billion question in the room. Maritime is responsible for, shipping is responsible for 3% of carbon emissions. We know that. And of course, the carbon emission goes in tandem with the increased international trade. You have more trade, more ships go, and there will be more emissions. So that's the pattern. So we need to break it. So maritime transport must decarbonize while supporting economic growth, enhancing environmental sustainability, and also ensuring regulatory certainty and compliance. So, there are many balls that you need to play. So it's the economic angle, it's the environmental angle, and also, regulatory certainty to ship owners. And we see that the ship owners are not ordering ships because they are waiting to see what are the regulations coming in their way. So things have to be done. Now, what we also say in the report is, at the same time, the impacts of shipping decarbonization on the most vulnerable economies must be continually assessed. And this is something that we have been doing at UNCTAD as IMO was progressing through their negotiations. And we need to provide technical and financial support to these impacted economies, especially we are talking about the small SIDs, small island developing nations, and plus these developed countries. So we need to balance these various objectives. So in UNCTAD, we are saying these things. We say we need to support a universal regulatory framework applicable to all ships, irrespective of their registration flags, ownerships, or operational areas, so in order to avoid a two-speed decarbonization process and to maintain a level playing field for shipping operators and traders everywhere. So that's number one. And regulation must minimize uncertainty, and which is already holding back ship owners, the yards, the ports, investment decisions. So we have seen this, and this will be a concern for the sector. And a level playing field for shipping and traders must be ensured by closing the gap between the conventional and alternative fuels, and this needs to be a must, because otherwise we fail. Now, also, if there is a levy on fuels or a carbon, a price, and must help close the price gap between traditional and low or zero carbon fuels. And it is extremely important that this contribution or the fee is also the funds that generated through such a fee or a contribution can support the smaller and vulnerable economies to achieve green and just transition. They are going to be affected because ships will not go their way. The freight rates will be much higher, ships will go slow, and there's a brunt of the cost of adjustment will be borne by small island economies and least developed countries, and we need to have a just transition, and we need to be happy.
Thank you very much indeed. I think All the ship owners I speak to, it's that regulatory certainty they're going to need, which is going to help de-risk investments. Absolutely important. And you'll be aware that we've put forward proposals for an economic measures based on a fund and reward. So ship owners pay into a fund when they burn fossil fuels, but they then be able to take some money out of the fund to help bridge that price gap between the alternative fuels and the fossil fuels they'll be replacing. But thank you for that. Carrying on with the theme of emissions management, we know that the transition to green fuels for the maritime sector poses severe economic questions, and as we've already mentioned, the price differential between the fuels is quite huge. When it comes to driving down emissions in an economically sustainable way, what steps do you believe ports are taking to maximise their emissions reduction, and what role do you see ports playing in accelerating that broader energy transition?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Yeah, ports have a major role to play in terms of their own emissions reduction and also in the broader energy transition for the sector as well. You have, within ports, obviously a big opportunity to switch to renewable energy sources in port operations for port facilities, as well as for industry within and adjacent to ports. And there are many examples of projects along those lines, from electrification and use of green fuels for port services vessels, using renewable energy sources for cranes and equipment to move containers around yards, shoreside electricity for ships, and then many ways to decarbonise industry located within and adjacent to ports as well. Also a lot of potential for ports to operate as hubs for renewable energy. In particular, we're seeing that happening for offshore and onshore wind power generation. But beyond that, what we touched on a little bit earlier is this major role ports have to support programs like port call optimization, just-in-time vessel arrivals, the benefits of which are highly positive for industry decarbonisation. As we mentioned, these programs support improving vessel turnaround times and making port operations more predictable, which frees up time for vessel operators to control speeds to reduce fuel burn and emissions. And conversely, of course, when you have very inefficient port call processes with chronic delays, excessive time waiting for berths, very low levels of berth productivity, and so on, you have situations where vessels need to increase speed to try and maintain schedules, which results in increased fuel consumption and more emissions. And then things like service recoveries can involve significantly higher sailing speeds and consequently much higher fuel consumption and emissions. So we're seeing a lot more focus now on identifying wasted time in port and directly linking wasted hours to a certain number of metric tons of bunker and associated costs and emissions. And it's a very big opportunity. In our global port performance data set in 2022, we saw a global average 30% of vessel port time spent on what we call the arrival process. That's about 11 hours per port call for every port call globally. Of that, 3 hours or so would be average for steam in time for the vessel to get from port limits to the berth, which is of course necessary time. So 8 hours per call is purely waiting time, which many would quite rightly see as avoidable waste. Port call startup and finish processes can also be a major source of waste. Startup is from when the vessel arrives at the berth to the start of cargo operations. Global best practice for that at some of the ports in Southeast Asia is about 20 minutes. But at some terminals, ships can routinely be alongside for 3 or 4 hours before the cargo operations even commence. So this is where ports can really contribute, to the wider decarbonisation agenda for the industry by tackling the waste in the system, whether that be making very static processes more dynamic, putting a lot more focus on measuring and analysing performance to find those efficiency gaps and then proactively working to close them. And as we've seen, the absence of shared information, single windows, etc., is a big cause of this kind of waste. Digitization is certainly the antidote to it, and developing solutions like the digital ecosystems mandated in the FAO Convention from early next year, should help to accelerate that process. So no question, very big role for ports to play, and many opportunities for them to support the decarbonisation of the industry.
Thank you, Taylor. Just before I move on to Alan, what are you seeing in the way of the congestion issues following the COVID pandemic? Is they resolved now, or are they still there?
Yeah, so we're just actually putting together our latest quarterly analysis of global port performance at the moment. We see the improvements are continuing. The US, we have big improvements in key performance metrics over the third quarter compared with last year. In berth productivity, very big reductions in vessel waiting times, and that's really across all of the regions there, the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Gulf ports as well. The yards have also cleared up. Dwell times, container dwell times are quite good. And it's a similar story globally. Chinese ports continue to improve performance, and also Southeast Asia as well. But these improvements have, of course, gone hand in hand with a significant drop in business and related, metrics like those excessive call sizes. So, quantities of containers loaded and discharged from single vessel calls. Those have all been dropping. So the driver of the improvements is the drop in business, unfortunately. Have the underlying issues been addressed? Almost certainly not. There are many projects to improve things on an individual port level, physical infrastructure projects, digitization projects, etc. But as I say, it's really the drop in business, that's driving the performance improvement we see at the moment. A lot more needs to be done to address the performance risks in the sector as a whole over the longer term. We've spoken about digitization. We are seeing plenty of projects at the moment, but still quite a long way to go, I would say.
Thank you, Tulloch. So turning to you, and perhaps looking ahead to the next 12 months, we've heard a little bit of your thoughts about the container side as well. But you've heard about the challenges facing the maritime industry, the regulatory uncertainty we talked about, shifting market and trade dynamics, the need to balance economic and environmental efficiencies. As a maritime logistics operator, what do you see as the biggest challenges to your business, and how are you preparing for the maritime trade outlook over the next 12 months? What signals do you think the shipping industry needs in order to face up to these challenges?
It's an interesting question. There's quite a few levels and depths to that. I might start by, firstly, I completely agree with Tulloch's point of view around, one of the critical tools to assist ports is digitization, and the impact that has not only on sort of, throughput, but also on carbon, which really comes because of throughput, because of, the reduction in waste. I think this industry, when you look at, global containerized freight in particular, is an incredibly complex industry in terms of all the discrete individual processes that are controlled and managed by different companies that have got to come together in harmony, in unique harmony, in order to for it all to work. And often the solution to fixing some of those nodal interface gaps is queuing theory, batch and queue, to try and maintain the individual asset or operational efficiency of the different areas. But ultimately, that becomes a compounding effect of waste and a compounding effect of waiting, which in effect, extends the supply chain, but it also means we burn more carbon and burn more things. I do agree that digitization is the solution, but I would also say that it will require all of the industry to start to think about being a bit more open with their data and being a bit more coordinated. Right now, there's a bit of an arms race around controlling data and digitalization of saying, buy my system and I'll make the pain go away, rather than how do we get all of those discrete elements of the total supply chain to come together and try and coordinate the element to actually optimize the flow. And we need to be obsessed with flow, and we need to be against queuing. So that my sort of comments and response. I completely agree with Turlok's viewpoint, but wanted to try and expand that a little bit broader into supply chain. To answer your question specifically around how do we, as a NVOCC and also as an overall logistics operator, see the challenges for next year in the maritime industry and the shipping industry, it is uncertainty is probably the biggest challenge, and that uncertainty is in demand, that uncertainty is in pricing, and that uncertainty is in regulation and regulatory effects and impacts. The most sort of pressing one, I think, for people who are looking in the European trade is obviously the EU emissions trading system and the uncertain nature of how that will be applied and priced through the shipping companies, then therefore through the freight forwarders, and then into the customers. What our opportunities are to try and offset that, either with carbon reduction strategies from a procurement standpoint and an offset strategy, or the opportunity to actually change the route or the pathways that you take. Will we see an increase in Mediterranean port calls and a switch to rail? And is that a valid strategy, or do we actually continue on and just see different port calls in order to try and get around some of the regulation? Will Felixstowe become completely congested because it's not in the EU that allows then you just say, well, I only went from Felixstowe to Rotterdam as the last part of the leg. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around how that will be applied. I think equally, will the EU extend the consortia block exemption regulation to try and again allow a more efficient use of capacity? But how does overcapacity play into that aspect? And in particular, what happens with overcapacity, with that uncertain demand area? Will we see an increased scrapping? Will we see an increased blanking? Will we see capacity just pile in? On one hand, what I'll say is, to be a customer in this industry is obviously, after the very sharp increase in prices through COVID, the customers are going to have, terrific pricing opportunities, but unfortunately, they're not going to have the regularity of supply. And that's why I go back to that kind of 3R concept. You've really got to work, if you're a shipper, you've got to work with, I think, companies who can really give you optionality, and not to promote freight forwarders and NVOCCs like ourselves, but we do provide that opportunity to actually look at what is the reliability you need, what is the responsiveness you need, what is the optionality you need in your supply chain. And I think as you're designing, your freight requirements for next year, those are things that you've really got to think through. And maybe always going for price isn't necessarily your best friend. Maybe going for flexibility, maybe going for responsiveness will actually help you.
Thank you, Alan. The questions are coming in thick and fast now, and I'll come back to those in a minute. So you've obviously raising the level of debate here, but actually it'd be interesting to hear both Shamika's and Tulok's thoughts on the next 12 months, and what do you think? So Shamika.
Can I agree with Alan and say that what we also see is the greater uncertainty. Anyway, we haven't started working on the RMT yet, but you know, we are looking at the larger economic picture for the global economy, and we just see uncertainty there. We see the uncertainty in international trade. I think it's the global economic slowdown, and then the geopolitical situation. And honestly, we are in a place we simply cannot see where we are heading, and that's not a good place to be for the world economy or for the shipping industry.
And Tilak?
Yeah, I think we'll definitely see an acceleration in the digitization initiatives and this focus on flow that Alan has mentioned in an effort to make supply chains more resilient and reduce risks and so on. From a port's perspective, you know, you always have intermittent issues cropping up with ports that can lead to, you know, delays and congestion events. But it's difficult to see the kind of system-wide congestion that we saw during the course of the pandemic in an environment where, you know, you have flat or very low demand growth, of course. And we would hope that that fact doesn't, you know, take from the urgency of, you know, de-risking the sector over the long term and making it more efficient over the long term, you know, particularly when we consider it in the context of the environmental agenda. So I would say, you know, definitely more digitization projects, more projects to address emissions at ports, but it's still not running at the pace that everyone would like to see to really impact the sector and de-risk the sector over the long term.
Thank you. And to turn to digitalization, there does seem to be the need for commonality in these processes, which is lacking. I think, Alan, you sort of alluded to that as well. Do you think that should be coming from a regulatory standpoint, so there's a regulatory sort of level playing field in this? Would that help, do you think? Perhaps turning to Alan.
Well, of course it would help, but how you achieve that, I think, is you know, nearly the impossible dream. I think really it requires the industry to start to think about, you know, the dimensions of competition, and is a bigger picture view of making, you know, data more easily transferable or easily accessible in the interest of the overall industry health and the interest of overall solutions, as opposed to currently, you know, the arms race to capture subscribers.
Thank you. Right, I'm just trying to just filter some of these many questions coming in, but one thing I did want to cover before we come to some of those is the geopolitical tensions we're encountering at the moment, particularly, you know, I call the Russia-Ukraine conflict and what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and how that's affecting the maritime transport trade. I don't know who would like to maybe just start, perhaps Shamika, is that something that you've been following at UNCTAD?
Guy, it's as in any other situation of whenever there is a geopolitical uncertainty, and then it affects the global economic performance, and then it affects international trade, and then starts, you know, it affects the shipping industry. And this is why the shipping industry does well when the global economy is doing well. The global economy does well when there is peace. And this is a simple equation. And we don't have, you know, the equation is broken right now.
Turk, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to Shamika's point. You know, you see some disruption at the ports. You know, also a little bit in terms of the conflict in the Middle East at the moment. But right now it's not too excessive. You have extended dwell times in some of the ports and that kind of thing. So not a massive impact we're seeing in the ports directly right now in terms of excessive delays and that kind of thing. And then, you know, from a broader perspective, I would agree with, you know, Shamika's, you know, comment that, you know, these events take from regional and economic growth and local economic growth, and that's really where the big impact on the industry is.
Thank you. And just on sort of staying a little bit on environmental issues as well. I mean, we've seen in recent days massively the reports about water shortages in the Panama Canal and the increased wait time actually of ships just to get through. And I read yesterday one LNG ship paid $4 million to jump the queue because of various things. Alan, maybe do you think this? How much of impact are you seeing in your company and what you're seeing elsewhere?
No doubt it's a disruption, right? It changes, again, it's about reliability of flow, it's about reliability of location and affordability of location. You know, shipping lines forced to potentially, you know, divert to East Coast or favour East Coast locations, you know, rather than West Coast on certain, you know, routes, and vice versa, depending on, you know, where the freight is coming from and trying to get to. So, you know, both war and environmental disruption creates disruptions in ways that we can't really predict or expect. And so, as much as we want stability from a war perspective or a, you know, a peacetime point of view, we want stability from an environmental, which means, you know, continue to push our obligation as an industry and our leadership opportunity to continue to decarbonise to try and address some of these factors.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, talking about that decarbonisation, I'm going to be wrapping up shortly and asking you for some final thoughts, because I suddenly realised there's only 9 minutes to go. So, do you see? There's a lot of focus, I think, on the shipping industry decarbonisation. We talked about the ports as well. What about the wider supply chain? You know, what do you think they should be doing, and how do we draw attention to their responsibilities? I don't know who perhaps would like to take that, Tulip.
So yeah, and the wider supply chain has a big role in pushing forward the other the service elements, say, of the supply chain, to invest in initiatives to reduce emissions, etc. At the end of the day, it's the cargo owners who have the economic value, call it that, in the supply chain, and that gives, you know, you made the point about regulation earlier on, which is of course a very effective way to get things done, but the other way is economic clout, and that's a function of the cargo owners, and it really goes back to the consumers, of course, ultimately, and what they're looking for. But if cargo owners start to, you know, for example, look for ports with faster turnaround times and, you know, more extensive initiatives to decarbonize and reduce emissions, you know, then these are areas more ports will invest in and explore. So I would say that's a key way to help, you know, drive these decarbonization agendas as we move forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Tulip. We're coming towards the end of this webinar. It's been absolutely fascinating. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. But perhaps I can go to each of the speakers and just give me sort of 3 points that you want our audience to take away on this really, really important issue. So can I start with you, Shamika?
Thank you, guys. So I think, you know, I'm reflecting our conversation. The supply chain efficiency, security, flexibilities, these are extremely important concepts as we go forward for the shipping industry to be healthy. We need to pay attention. And as I said, our way of looking at these issues is the diversification rather than friendshoring. To build supply chain efficiency, the value chain efficiency, and so forth. And the second point is maritime transport must decarbonize like everybody else. And these are existential issues that we are talking about. Every sector has to take their responsibility. I mean, maritime, I must say that the maritime sector has taken steps, much more forward-looking and out there than many other sectors. So we should congratulate the sector in that sense. And in all these issues, we need to pay attention to developing countries and their predicament, because they are going to be the small and the small islands, the least developed countries, are the ones who are going to get most affected when the ships don't go their way. So the freight rates will be very high. Ships will not go their way because they don't have deep ports, and the ships are getting bigger and bigger because of the technology. And any kind of decarbonization regulations coming their way will be costly to adapt to the situation and to have their food security, energy security, and their economic growth. So these are extremely important issues. And I also must have a shout out to what Turlock has been saying all throughout: digitalization. And this is a must, and this is no longer an option. We are living through a digital technological revolution, and we need to digitalize the entire supply chain. And this is something we are doing at UNCTAD. And it is not a technology project for us. And it is really a project where there is political will, things happen. It's not technology. Technology is the easiest part of it. It's bringing of all governments and bringing of all stakeholders together to go forward is digitalization, and that's the hard part. So,
thank you. And Alan?
So perhaps I'll go back to narrate 3 points. I'll go back to my 3 R's of supply chain that I think we need to focus on. We all need and want a resilient supply chain. We need it to be resilient to the uncertainty that we have going forward. So we need companies to survive. We don't need them to go under. We need to get clarity on what our optionality is, and therefore we need a responsive supply chain, because we as customers or consumers, we need to get our goods to market. So we've got to respond to these challenges and to these changes and to these uncertainties that we have. But I would finish on the last point, which is we need a responsible supply chain, and the absolute obligation that we have across the end-to-end to decarbonise. And the encouragement I would give to anyone that's listening is don't focus on the big stuff, focus on the little stuff, because there's a lot that we can do as individuals that makes a true difference, as well as the more traditional reliance on, government legislation and taxation or schemes or other formats that will drive change. It will. We have an industry level, responsibility to go and find the solutions around fuel source, fuel availability, alternatives. But as individuals, we can start to make choice in who we buy from, how we buy. We can make choice around what we do in terms of looking at the overall end-to-end supply chain. As Turlock pointed out, through digitalization, we could actually take a dramatic amount of carbon out of the supply chain right now, just by changing the way we actually looked at flows, and we looked at things without changing a single fuel source or spending a single cent on new equipment. So the opportunity for us is enormous to make a difference, but it requires people to work together towards a common goal.
Thank you. And Turlock, you've got about a minute.
I've got about a minute. I guess, my key point would be that, gateway port efficiency is central to supply chain resilience. That's a lesson we learned very, very swiftly over the last few years. We need to work on port efficiency for supply chain resilience, and also critically for the decarbonisation agenda. And the big opportunity for that lies in digitisation. Always some deficiencies in physical infrastructure, and that can be in locations with a lot of potential for sourcing. But the big opportunity really is getting more out of the assets and services that we already have in place through digitization. And I expect 2024 to be a year when we see a lot of acceleration in those kind of projects.
Thank you very much.
Leave it at that. I think we're nearly out of time.
That's perfect timing. Perfect timing. It's and I think a real common theme through there is that some quick wins, particularly around digitalization, could really help the efficiency side of it. But to my panelists, thank you so much for your really engaging discussion. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts with the audience and taking the time to join us today. Thank you all for watching and for listening to this webinar. We wish you a good day ahead, and thank you all once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.